Hi, welcome to 5-minute devotionals from Mark. Today we're in Mark chapter 9, and we'll be starting in verse 30. I'm Dennis, one of the elders and teachers at North Park, and be glad to talking with you and meeting with you in this way today. As others have already explained, a lot of Mark is written in such a way as to be action, jumping from one thing to another, and leaving out the connections and the details of things sometimes. And it looks like at first glance that verses 30 through 50 that there's 3 or 4 different things going on here, but I think we'll find that there's really a common thread running through all of it, as of course there's the theme of Christ running through all of the scriptures. If you remember, previous to this, the disciples had just been trying to heal a demon-possessed person, and they struggled with it. They weren't able to do it, and Christ came and took care of the issue, healed the person, got rid of the demon, and had a teaching moment with his disciples as they asked, why couldn't we do this? And he taught them that some kinds are difficult to do, and it takes much prayer in this case. Of course, we know it was the will of God in this case, because it was a teachable moment for the disciples and for us, and now. We're looking into verse 30. The disciples are following Christ down the trail, down the road towards Capernaum as they traveled through Galilee. And as they went, they were not gathered closely around him because they couldn't. They had to string out behind him on the narrow road, but they were talking amongst themselves and talking about who was going to be the greatest in the kingdom and have the best position with Christ when the time came. And they continued that. They got to the house, and before they got to the house, what Jesus was teaching them along the road was a foretelling of his suffering and death and resurrection, that he would be killed, that he would rise again 3 days later. And the scriptures tells us in verse 32 that they did not understand, but they were afraid to ask. And perhaps because of what they'd been discussing, and now it looked like they not only did they fail to heal this other person, but they failed to understand what he was trying to teach them. They came to Capernaum and went to a house. When they went in the house, he started asking them questions, because Jesus always knows, right? He asked them what they were talking about while they were walking along the way, and they were looking back at it. I think they were a little ashamed, but they were silent because what they talked about was who was the greatest. But Jesus sat down, not uncommon and you go into a house, you sit down, but he called the 12, and it's the rabbi as the teacher. When he sat down and addressed them, it was a teaching time. So they gathered around in spite of their feelings or uncertainties or questions. They gathered around. And he said to them in verse 35, if anyone wants to be first, he shall be last of all and servant of all. One of the commentaries I was looking at says the word servant here was connotation more of a slave rather than a servant in the true sense of the word. Servants tend to choose to serve and do it in their own way, in their own choice, where a slave had no choice. A slave needed to be the lowest on the totem pole, had no choice, was forced to do it, and not that we are forced to serve Christ, but we should desire that with all of our hearts. But the lowest of the low, the slave. And then Jesus did a little different thing. He called a child to come. He pulled the child up on his lap and enfolded him in his arms. Nowadays, it's not a good thing to do in some situations to do that with a child. But, of course, he's the Son of God, so I'm sure that the child was very relaxed and took comfort. He says, whoever receives one child like this in my name receives me, and whoever receives me not, and whoever receives me does not just receive me, but him who sent me. He was telling them that they must be innocent and receptive like a child. I have 3 grandchildren now under the age of 3, and I spend a lot of time with that 3-year-old. And he is always asking questions. He is always taking everything that I tell him and everything that we do and asking why and what is that. And I really believe that he would believe anything that I told him. So I need to be careful with what I teach him, and be careful about even teasing him sometimes, because he doesn't always know the difference. But he has that receptive innocence of a child. Later on in this section, Jesus warns them to be careful of what you teach to someone who is young in the faith. As we disciple people, as we reach out to them, teach them, we need to be very careful in what we're teaching, so that we don't put our wants, desires, opinions with the same level as the Scriptures, where we want to teach what the Scripture says and how that applies in their lives. But the common thread through all of this section is humility. They must accept Christ as a little child. They must be willing to serve, not to take their place in the front. And what are we doing now to build ourselves up rather than to serve Christ as a child would do? Are we willing to put our thoughts, our desires, our opinions, our understanding aside to listen to Jesus, to dig into His Word, to learn from Him? We need to be willing to do that at all times, just like a child would do, just like a slave would do, and listen to our Master and our Teacher, Jesus Christ. Thanks. Talk to you more later.